Welcome to This Explainer, everyone. Today, we're exploring a historical event that literally shapes the lives and the hearts of over 1 billion people. Now, when you or I think of a new year, we're probably picturing, fireworks, big celebrations, fresh starts, right? But for a huge portion of the world, the start of the Islamic lunar calendar brings this profound, heavy silence. It's a completely different atmosphere that totally flips our usual celebratory expectations upside down.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, A Different New Year.
So, for a massive portion of the world, the month of Muharram is definitely not about partying. It's actually a really stark contrast. On one hand, you have the traditional New Year, the fireworks, the resolutions. But on the other hand, Muharram brings a heavy silence, deep mourning, and a focus on an unbreakable legacy of sacrifice. And while the month does hold other historical significance, like the saving of Moses, today it's universally known for a massive tragedy. A tragedy that shook the very foundations of Islamic history back in 680 AD, out on the scorching desert plains.
And that brings us to Section 2, The Gathering Storm in Iraq, 680 AD.
To really understand why there's this global mourning going on, the historical sources transport us back to a shifting political landscape. The Islamic Empire was going through some incredibly tumultuous changes, and right at the absolute center of this storm was Hussain ibn Ali. He was the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was deeply rooted in foundational Islamic values, known far and wide for his wisdom, his compassion, and just this absolutely unwavering moral compass. Now on the flip side, you had the new ruler Yazid, and his reign was historically marked by corruption and a really sharp departure from those foundational values.
Yazid demanded absolute allegiance from the empire's top figures. But for Hussein, swearing allegiance to a tyrant meant actively validating oppression. This wasn't just some clever political maneuver. For him, it was a fundamental matter of truth. He knew that validating this oppression meant betraying his faith entirely. But he also knew for sure that refusing Yazid meant facing certain death. And this brilliantly illustrates Hussein's philosophical core. Reading through the historical accounts, you find quotes like this one: "I do not see death as anything but martyrdom, and living with oppressors as anything but agony." I mean, wow, this was a man completely anchored to his principles. With that incredible resolve, Hussein and a small, devoted group of followers set out, only to be intercepted and forced to camp in the totally barren desert of Karbala.
Which leads us right into Section 3, the Siege of Karbala and the Day of Ashura.
So Hussein's group is now trapped in this blistering desert standoff, and the historical odds here are just terrifying. 72. That's it. That is the entire number of devoted companions and family members standing alongside him in this incredibly harsh, unforgiving environment.
Now compare that tiny number to tens of thousands. That was the massive size of Yazid's army surrounding them. Instantly, you get a sense of the impossible stakes here, right? It's a tiny group of 72 facing down the military force of an entire empire. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario, but with much, much darker consequences.
The timeline of how this unfolded is honestly harrowing. They arrived at Karbala in 680 AD, but the real horror kicks in on the 7th of Muharram. Yazid's massive army did the unthinkable. They completely cut off Hussein's camp from their only water source. For 3 agonizing days in the blistering heat, Hussein's camp, which, remember, included women and young children, was deprived of a single drop of water. This cruel siege takes us directly to the 10th of Muharram, a date forever known as the Day of Ashura.
The night before Ashura gives us one of the most poignant micro-narratives in this whole history. It's known as the choice in the dark. Hussein gathered his followers and intentionally plunged his tent into complete darkness by putting out the lamps. He told them point blank that they were free to flee safely under the cover of night because the army only wanted him. But when the lamps were relit, not a single person had left. Every last one of them chose to stay and stand with him, knowing exactly what the dawn was going to bring.
What happened the next day wasn't really a battle, it was a methodical, heartbreaking slaughter. First, Hussein's valiant companions went out to the battlefield and fell. Then, his own family members perished. And in what is probably the most gut-wrenching detail from the historical accounts, his 6-month-old infant son, Ali Asghar, was struck by an arrow while Hussein was actively pleading for water for the baby. Finally, heavily wounded, intensely thirsty, and entirely alone, Hussein himself was killed.
Now what's really interesting about this next part is Section 4, an unbreakable legacy.
Because in the aftermath, it turns out Yazid's apparent victory was a total illusion. He genuinely thought he could just bury Hussein's message in the sands of Karbala, but he was incredibly wrong. And that's largely thanks to Hussein's courageous sister Zainab. After the slaughter, the women of Hussein's family were taken captive. But instead of remaining silent, Zainab stood directly in the oppressor's courts and delivered speeches that were so powerful they literally ignited a spark of rebellion. She essentially laid the groundwork that would eventually topple Yazid's entire empire.
And this brings us to how this event echoes today, more than 1,300 years later. During Muharram, millions of people globally gather in Majalis, or gatherings of sorrow. They listen to eulogies and they weep for the martyrs. And, really beautifully, millions more set up stalls to distribute free food and cold water, known as niyaz, to strangers on the street. They are directly honoring that agonizing thirst of Karbala by making sure absolutely no one around them goes thirsty today.
So the crucial point is here in our final section, a universal human story.
You see, Muharram isn't just an isolated historical event. It completely transcends geography and culture. The greatest philosophical takeaway from Karbala is that numbers do not define victory. It teaches us that a small, incredibly dedicated group of people standing firmly on the side of justice can echo through eternity. Hussein's 72 companions defeated tens of thousands of soldiers, not on the physical battlefield, obviously, but in the enduring pages of history.
In fact, the reach of this story is just astounding. Iconic world leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela have explicitly cited Imam Hussein's sacrifice as a profound inspiration for their own struggles against oppression. Think about that for a second. The courage displayed in that desert 1,300 years ago has fueled massive movements for justice and freedom across entirely different centuries.
So, as long as there is injustice in the world, the message of Muharram is going to remain deeply, urgently relevant. I want to leave you with a really provocative thought, drawn directly from our source material. When faced with a choice between what is easy and what is right, where do we stand? Take a moment to genuinely reflect on that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If the legacy of Karbala moved you, I definitely encourage you to share this understanding with others. Keep seeking out structured knowledge, stay curious, and I'll catch you in our next explainer.